Ooh.
Are you on the air again?
Yep, we're back on. Right. On again.
You going to explain what happened?
Yes. So, folks, welcome back to the broadcast. My apologies. The post office Wi-Fi strikes again in this house. So, I'm very, very sorry. So, listen, we're going to basically take off where we finished off there. So, obviously, before the Wi-Fi cut out. So, Joe, you were talking about the role that the Undertaker in Gibraltar.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said and made the point, there are a number of heroes around the Gibraltar story, and some are unsung, some of them are known. The Undertaker in Gibraltar, there was great difficulty in finding an Undertaker. Obviously, if we were to get the remains home, they had to be in coffins, and all of that had to be done. So before we left Belfast, the local firm here, a family firm called Healy's, had engaged an Undertaker after great difficulty in Gibraltar. And after we had identified the remains, we travelled to a small undertaker's shop in the centre of Gibraltar. I instructed him legally that he was to take the bodies, to take the remains as quickly as possible into the hands of the British authorities. He was to put them in coffins, and they were ready to be ready as quickly as possible for us to leave. And as yet at that period in time, we still didn't know how we were leaving. He explained that even normal deaths, holiday makers or other deaths where bodies had to be transported back to Ireland or to Britain, it took up to 6 weeks. We were anxious to be away well before that. And he also told me that there would be difficulties down the line that hadn't been foreseen, and he was absolutely right, and there were. I then instructed him to embalm the remains and to lead line the coffins. And the reason for that was that I didn't want, under any guise or any excuse, that the remains would be taken from us and either held or buried. We didn't really know what to expect. And by this stage, it was 11 o'clock. We left Gibraltar, again under escort. On the way to Gibraltar, we came through a small Spanish town called La Linea, and ironically enough, its name translates in the English as the line. We were trying to escape this caravan of journalists, and we had pulled into what we thought was a park. We seen a small family hotel, spotted it. So on our return across the border at Gibraltar, our return into Spain, we went back to where that hotel was, and it was indeed a small family hotel. We went there, we booked in. We were in the hotel maybe 15, 20 minutes. Very, very small hotel. The owner of the hotel came to say, and his words were, "I know who you are." And we went, right, fair enough. And he said, "Look, this is not, La Linea is not perhaps safe for you. The reason is that Gibraltar at that stage had got very much British laws, so the pubs, for instance, closed early.
Right.
So a lot of the squatties, a lot of the British soldiers on furlough crossed over into La Linea, and I'm not suggesting they done anything other than what young men do, but he was worried that they would come across us, they would discover us, and there could be difficulties. He then said that he was going to consult with his family, and with their permission it would be decided whether we could stay or not. They did consult, and we did stay.
So obviously, later that night, you got arrested, didn't you? At one stage,
we did. We got arrested by the Spanish police, but just part of the general harassment. What happened was in the middle of it, the next night, the next day, we spent trying to make arrangements to leave. There's a border dispute, as I've said, between Spain and Gibraltar. Goods cannot travel freely between either side. So we were trying to avoid at all costs that the British would take control of the bodies. We were there to do that. And we were trying to, if possible, to ensure that what we would do is we would fly the remains home. That meant toying with the idea of taking the remains out of Gibraltar into Spain and then flying to some, or travelling to some European main airport, Spain or France. We were quite close to both, and then to fly to Dublin. We were trying, people in Ireland, there was a team in Ireland set up to try and get us home. We were there to try and get the remains and then to travel home. And so we spent the next day trying to do that. At one stage we were going to travel by boat to Morocco. Then that wasn't possible. We were trying to charter flights. And at the time, we didn't know why we couldn't charter flights. We later discovered, and it was one of the big surprises of Gibraltar, what was going on. So we were having all these difficulties. If we were going to fly, whoever was coming for us had to have permission from the MOD, the British Ministry of Defence, because the airport, as everything else in Gibraltar, is under the guise of some form of British military establishment. So the runway is an MOD runway, and you had to have written permission to travel and to land on it, which we didn't have, and it looked like we weren't going to have. And that was because there was a further humiliation that we would depend upon the British to get us home.
Yep. So how long actually was the process from you got there until you actually got on the plane going home?
10 days.
10 days?
Well, you asked me about being arrested. What happened was in the middle of the night, the middle of the next night, and we had spent all this time trying to get stuff sorted out and trying to get transport and trying to see if we could get the Spanish to waiver the rates and let us go through the border checkpoints. And at some stages it looked like we did, and other stages where they weren't going to, and so on and so forth. But what happened the next night, in the middle of the night, the owner woke us to tell us that the police were downstairs and they were about to arrest us, and that he would keep them downstairs to allow us to get dressed, and he didn't really know what it was about and all of that. So we got arrested and we got brought to a local station. And there seemed to be no rhyme or reason. The people in the station didn't know why we were arrested. They didn't know under what authority. We were in a drunk tank type cell, iron railings around it, bars on it, in the middle of a room. And we were there for a couple of hours, and I had left the hotel. At the time I smoked, and I had left the hotel with no cigarettes, and didn't really want to ask Spanish cops for cigarettes. And then there was a commotion at the doorway of the police station, and these women got bundled in very unceremoniously, getting punched and slapped, and they opened the door and they threw them in with us. And so this small confined space was then at this stage quite packed, full of people. And the women involved were both drunk and rowdy, and we didn't understand what they were saying. So we were kind of a wee bit of distance from them, and then I noticed that one of the women had a moustache, and then I realised that they were transvestites who had been arrested, and some of those who were arrested spoke English, and I asked them for a cigarette, and lo and behold, I had cigarettes and I was smoking. In the early hours of the morning, we were, again through intervention of somebody senior, this time in the Spanish police, we were brought back to our hotel, never given an explanation, and to this day, can only surmise why we were detained.
So, after you obviously get back to the hotel, what's the sort of timeline of getting a plane eventually organised then?
Well, it wasn't that we couldn't get planes. What happened, it was both the combination of not being able to get planes, and so the people who were here managing that end of it had hired a plane, say for instance from Ryanair, Aer Lingus and so on. And once the documentation was to be signed, they then discovered that the company withdrew, the company pulled out. and the company wouldn't fulfil their commitment. So we were getting instructions. We have a plane coming tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and then we were told, no, it's not going to be here. We have a plane tomorrow night at 9 o'clock. No, it's not going to be here, and so on. It wasn't until a lot of years later that we realised that we really discovered what was happening. The planes that we were trying to charter were flying to Dublin. Charlie Hawkey, the then Taoiseach Prime Minister and a member of Fianna Fáil, a leader of Fianna Fáil, Charlie Hawkey intervened. Once a company agreed that they would be a charter, what happened was he then got the civil aviation authorities to query their ability to fly, or their licence to fly, or their licence to land. And the idea was that he was trying to force us to land within British jurisdiction and avoid the embarrassment that was going to be quite clear of mass funerals. So we didn't really understand that. We didn't discover that until months later. So there was a series of stops and starts, and we're going, we're not going, we're not, we're going, we're going. Eventually we were told, confirmed, we have a plane and it is flying from Luton. It's going to be with you at 8 o'clock the following morning. So this was quite late on I think the 7th night. And we had to do a number of things. First of all, by this stage the remains were released from the naval base. They were with the Undertaker. They were in the Undertaker's parlour. So we had to travel back and we were in and out of Gibraltar several times every day we were there. But we travelled back, and all of this was in the context of both a Spanish police escort or a Gibraltarian police escort. So we travelled back into Gibraltar. I instructed the Undertaker to have the remains on the airport, on the MOD airport, for the following morning, an hour before the plane was to land. We confirmed with the Gibraltarian authorities that the plane had landing status, and in fact it didn't have landing status. It had what's called turnaround status,
yep.
Which means the plane comes in, it turns around, stops momentarily, you load the plane with whatever, your cargo, your passengers, and the plane doesn't stop. The propellers,
the engines
keep going. So that was to be the case. The following morning we left under Spanish guard. We left the hotel for the last time. We travelled to the airport, dismally wet, bright, early morning. We got to where the base was, the airport, MOD airport strip. When we got there, we were again stopped at the entrance and asked to sign the Official Secrets Act, which we said we wouldn't once again. This time we were arrested. The other times we were detained, but this time we were actually
arrested, right, okay.
Where we put into like a small holding cell just at the entrance to it, and we were there under guard, perhaps half an hour, and I then heard the drone of the plane coming overhead, and we could see through the window, and I could see in the distance a plane coming over, and it seemed to, or I was convinced that it turned and left, and we were then...
You thought your plane was gone then?
Thought it was away. We were then, shortly after that, we were then released, and we were brought on to this airstrip, which was, it's the airstrip at Gibraltar is part of it. It runs right through across the sea and into Gibraltar itself. So we were in this windscrap waiting on the plane coming, and the remains, the 3 coffins arrived. The RAF officer in charge of that base approached me to say that without his support, without his assistance, we wouldn't get the remains into the plane. Because of the height, and that he would instruct his men, with our consent, to remove the remains from the coffins, the three hearse, and begin to load them once the plane had arrived. And I was faced with a dilemma. It was quite clear that we weren't going to get them loaded. The plane was 20 feet off the ground. We didn't have any means, and I took the decision, which I believed was the right decision, that we would accept their assistance. Just as that, and behind us, there's these huge hangars that you can imagine on a runway of an airport, an our runway. We hangars for maintenance is carried out where planes or aviation equipment, and just as I kind of became aware they were behind us, that the thunder started. Just thunder started to make itself felt, and I thought we were in the middle of a thunderstorm, and my next thought was, this plane's not going to be able to land, only to realise it was actually Gibraltarian workers banging on the corrugated doors of these hangars, right. Massive doors, and shouting abuse out through, in a very cowardly way, shouting abuse out through the slits in the doors. The plane eventually arrived. It turned around, it stopped. The captain came off the plane. I instructed him that we were going to load, and he opened the hatch and we began the process. We were travelling up and down the plane by ladder, by not step ladder, but just a domestic ladder, and we eventually loaded. Prior to that, I had noticed that a handle was broken on one of the coffins, and had challenged this RAF officer as to how it happened, and he assured me that it wasn't, they didn't break it, it had been like that when they had loaded it in. I thanked the undertaker. I said goodbye to Maria's brother. There was some surprise that he wasn't coming home with me. He never was to come home with me. I was always to travel home alone, and with the 3 coffins on board and myself up the ladder, and the captain and the navigator and a co-pilot, we began the taxi and we left Gibraltar in a turbojet. The plane was a 60-seater plane. There were 2 seats in the plane. All the other seats had been removed. There was a seat for me and periodically the navigator when he wasn't up at the front of the plane. The remains were strapped into the centre body of the plane. The turbo was, which is really all that we could get, was a very long flight. I think the flight in total was nearly 5 hours, which it shouldn't have been that long. But anyway, and I talked to them. I talked to Dan and Sean and Maria, and I talked to them the whole time. There's film footage of me just entering the plane off this ladder, and I turned to say goodbye to Maria's brother. And people have misunderstood what I was doing. What I was actually doing, as well as saying goodbye, I was saying to those assembled, we done it. We're going home. And we took off and we began the journey back to Dublin.
See, on the flight itself, so what do you, obviously, you've sat and talked to them the whole way through it, so are you sort of feeling like relief, pride, or I mean, what?
Well, I was
a traumatic ordeal you've sort of been through for 10 days, like. I
was physically exhausted, and I was mentally exhausted. But I don't know. I think it's like somebody who pulls that extra mile in a sports game. Somebody who takes the last kind of piece of strength out of them, and so it was defence, it was pride, it was emotional. I was crying. It was all of the above, all rolled into one. But the most important thing was I was fulfilling a promise made to the families that I would bring them home. And
so there's the whole time you were there, there's no way at any time you thought, well, I'm not going to go home on my own here? Like,
I never was coming home on my own. I would have been arrested and held in Gibraltar or wherever. I never would have left I never would have left Gibraltar
without the remains.
Never.
So actually, we've heard you tell this story a few times, Joe, and the thing that was probably the real emotional part for me was when you eventually landed at Dublin and you had to go through the hangar where all the workers were working. So tell us a bit about that there.
Well, the pilot and co-pilot, the pilot was a Romanian, the co-pilot was an Indian from India. And they very much kept me informed as to what was happening. They were aware that I was talking to the remains, and they were aware that I was obviously emotionally involved in all of that. They had been hired that morning, and they had flown from Luton. Before they had before they had been given their approval to taxi and to leave, they were visited by the English Special Branch, who told them they would never ever work from Luton again for taking the contract. So they had made the decision, and clearly I had made the decision. So they kept me informed and kind of told us where we were and how far how long we would be before we had ironed. And they told us that they had just, as we approached the Irish coast, we could see the coast. They came out and told me that they had been instructed to taxi to a part of Dublin Airport that is reserved for planes in distress. It's not the normal part of the airport, not near any of the commercial runways. And they done that, obviously. And when they landed, taxied and stopped, and opened the door, the hatch door, put the ladder down. These 4, I think, senior customs and guards officers came in and said that one of them actually welcomed us home, but they said that they would take over from there, that they would unload the remains, that there was quite a large crowd at the Chapel of Remembrance at the airport, and that the families were in the chapel. And they would take the remains and they would bring them to the chapel. And I would be escorted separately to where the chapel was, which wasn't a great distance away. And I said I wouldn't go. I said that my responsibility was to stay with the remains until they were handed over to the families. And they agreed to that. So I supervised the remains being unloaded, almost a reversal of what had happened had it been loaded.
Yeah.
And they were on small trucks, just one after another. And we entered this huge industrial hangar where there was a couple of hundred people easily working, and there was lathes going, there was 5 or 6 different radios playing, there were men shouting, talking. There was all of that noise of a workplace, and we were only feet in the doorway, and I heard someone saying, "That's the Gibraltar plane." And then there was a hush. It was almost if someone hit a switch, just happened nearly instantly. And so we were going through this workplace in absolute silence. And in the distance, somebody began saying a prayer, and that prayer just resonated right round through the body, and people were praying as we travelled through it. We went to the church, the Chapel of Remembrance. I met the families, met senior Republicans, handed over the remains, because that was my responsibility. In theory, anyway, my responsibility finished at that stage.
So, obviously, it's sort of well documented of obviously what happened getting back to Belfast. Were you sort of informed by the guards or anything beforehand? Listen, look, we're going to be expecting a bit of bother here on the way up the road, or whatever.
In fact, it was the complete opposite. We were told by the guards that the RUC had agreed that they wouldn't interfere. Just prior to these funerals, there had been a long series of battles where Republican dead funerals had been attacked by the RUC and by the British Army. And we suspected that was going to be the case. And these were long, hard-fought battles where families were battened and coffins were ceremoniously dragged from mourners, and all of that. Wake houses had been raided. All of that was happening. we were mindful of that. So the idea was, by this stage, by the way, it was about 4 o'clock in Dublin. So there was a consensus, or at least a thought, that what we should do is not travel at night, travel the following morning with the remains in daylight.
Right.
We informed the guards that was our thinking, and we were assured, as were the families, we were assured that there would be no interference, that the guards would travel with us to the border. We could stop where we wished to stop. We could walk where we wanted to walk. But at the border, they would hand us over to the senior RUC, who the guards had been given an assurance, let alone the families. We would be straight on to a motorway that would take us non-stop into Belfast and to the homes of those who had died, to Dan, Sean and Mairead.
And that wasn't the case then?
As soon as we crossed the border and the guards withdrew, the RUC back and charged the coffins and the hearse.
Seriously?
The minute, the last wheel, the last tire had only just crossed the border, and they back and charged, and they tried to drag people from, family members, this is, from behind the hearse and all of that. They attacked and beat some of the undertakers. We managed to get the coffins, get the hearse travelling, and we drove into Newry, where again, huge crowds in Newry. There was huge crowds everywhere along the way, but in Newry there was huge crowds, and the RUC again attacked the remains, blocked off. They actually rammed hearse with their armoured trucks, and they fired plastic bullets. They tried to split the mourners' cars from the family cars, from all of that there. One stage I had said to Jerry Adams, I think we should go and seek sanctuary, and this is how bad it was in Newry Cathedral. Jerry Adams, being who he is, said if we stop, we'll never get started again. They'll lay siege to the road and we'll not get started. And he was right, of course. Just outside Newry, and all of this was done with us appealing to the cops to let us through, and the families appealing to the cops to let us through. When we got on the other side of Newry, you enter into a loyalist area. The cars were attacked with rocks and stones while the RUC stood by and watched. Then under the guise of offering protection, which was of course not the case, they dragged undertakers, physically stopped the cortege of the three hearse and the family cars. I was in a family car with the Savage family and the McCann family, and they physically dragged the drivers of the hearse out of some of them and put RUC men in, and they stole the bodies. We travelled on to Belfast, and as you know, because your family were part of Belfast where we should have arrived, but there was thousands of people waiting to pay their respect. When we got there without the remains, and we explained. We actually initially the RUC and the British Army wouldn't let us leave the cars to go and explain to those who had waited for hours waiting on us coming back because of all the delay. This stage it's 1 o'clock in the morning. We explained that the bodies had been stolen. We didn't know where they were. And then we discovered that what had happened was the RUC and RUC drivers had stopped had brought each body in turn to their family home.
And sort of trying to make it as if they done a good job and sort of...
Well, it looked like it was going to be... I mean, I know the reason for these things, but it looked like what it was going to be was a continuation of the battle of the funerals. It looked like, because around each family home, there were hundreds of members, heavily armed, heavily equipped, members of both the British Army and the RUC, and they lay siege to the three wake houses, and anyone, including family members, anyone going into the wake, traditional Irish wake, the last 3 days, anybody going to the wake or leaving the wake was stopped, searched. People were arrested for no reason other than they were going to the wakes. So this stealing of the bodies, and it had happened before, very seldom, but it had happened before. But it looked like this was the sign of things to come.
So, obviously, Joe, we could literally do a whole another podcast over what happened in the days to come, right? Obviously, with the funerals, and then the funerals after the Michael Stone incident and stuff. But I think what I sort of want to bring the end of this is obviously now we spoke earlier on, you're presenting the Scalta show. I think it was sort of brought ahead that after those sort of few crazy weeks in West Belfast, we were basically seen as like thugs and scumbags, and the feel was born then out of basically them, obviously the corporals and stuff.
Well, it goes back, Rory, to there's very little that the British do in our country that isn't done for a reason. Never good reasons, but there's very little that the Brits do that isn't calculated. So all of what I've explained to you was a way of inflicting the knockout punch on Republicans to, if you like, to break their morale, to demonstrate to other volunteers, this is what's going to happen to you, this is what's going to happen to your families. and to really break the heart of Republicans. The crowds who met the Gibraltar funerals, the crowds who lined the road in villages and towns across the island of Ireland that we passed through, demonstrated that the reverse was the case, that people were more determined and that resistance had came through oppression. What happened with Fela was that the British media, having been unable to break the spirit of Republicans, began to label Republicans as thugs and gangsters and all of that. There was an incident at a funeral where 2 British soldiers unfortunately were killed in a confrontation with the IRA. A funeral had been attacked. People assumed that this was a second attack on another funeral. All of that was going on.
Yep.
Fela was the way of the community, and I know you've been heavily involved in Fela, but Fela was a way of the community. Fela is an Irish word for festival, of saying we're not broken, we're certainly hurt, but we are a proud community with our own values. And Fela was born, and of course it's ran ever since. It's got bigger every year, even with COVID and even with all the difficulties. The virtual Fela is bigger now than it's ever been.
So just the end up then, so obviously was mentioned at the start, you recently have been the interviewer, not the interviewee, on the Scale to Show. So tell us a wee bit about that whole episodes of these interviews you've been doing and how they all came about.
Well, it goes back really to what you're trying to do here tonight. We are a community that has lots of talent. We're a community that's very proud. We're a community that has great imagination, great invention. We have a very proud history of being self-sufficient. So Scalta is an Irish word that means biz, give us the news, what's happening. It's probably no translation as defined as that, but it means just let's know, let's happen. And so what I've been doing really from March of last year is interviewing people within our community who have made an impact, not only within the community, but an impact in wider society. So I've interviewed people who are doctors, who are actors, people who are community activists, people from the LGBT community who have fought for those rights, people who support Black Lives Matter, people who have stood up for a whole variety of people who are involved in education, all of that. And I'm going to do another interview tomorrow, Tuesday, Ireland time, and the person on it is a psychiatrist, someone who's been involved in psychotherapy, and someone who has been a counsellor for many of those who are really the sufferers of conflict.
And actually, I see my ma's listening downstairs. You did have my own brothers on as well, Nell, the golden child of the family. So I'll just get that in there, because she's listening downstairs.
Let me tell you, I have to say this. Niall says you're the golden child of the family.
Aye, sure you
this was Niall said that when you were growing up, that your mother used to take your food off the plate and give it to Niall. And
well, here he's getting as big as me now, so he is.
I don't know whether or not Niall would agree with you. So no, Niall's a good lad. Niall, just what you should mention about him, Niall is part of that generation that excelled in this community. He's an award-winning photographer. He works with young people. He works in Fela. He's someone who has got extraordinary photographic talent, and he puts it to good use in terms of the community from which he came. And that's what Fela is about. Fela is about this community showcasing the talent that exists, just the same as we're doing tonight here. This community, through your medium, is speaking for itself rather than depend upon, commercial radio to defend its interests, which it will never do.
So listen, Joe, thank you very much. We'll let you go downstairs and have a wee yarn with Dad before I'll drop you home. So we're going to finish up here, folks. Again, thank you very much to Joe Austin, who's come this evening.
Rory, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, let's bring your mic back up in there.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure on this very important anniversary. So thank you.
Not a problem. So, folks, listen, we're going to play one more song to finish the episode. And again, apologies about the slight the cutout in the middle of the interview, but we'll share both episodes anyway. So they're both still there. You can watch. So again, cheers to Joe for coming up. He doesn't do a lot of interviews. Well, very very rarely, and obviously. Again, thanks to my dad for twisting his arm for getting to do this. So we're going to finish up with the only song we can play, folks. at the end of the show with, the Streets of Gibraltar, on the 33rd anniversary on Saturday there. So, of course, this song was written by Mickey and Maura. Of course, we're going to play the Irish Brigade version, so we are. Mickey and Maura McNally, very good supporters of the show, and Mickey's going to be on in the next few weeks of just talking over the weekend there, so it'll be a good interview to look forward to. So yeah, we're going to finish up with this song, folks. Again, before we shoot on, just let you all know that if you haven't got your copy of this CD yet, go onto the podcast page, folks, here on Facebook, Rebs for Hope. That's my brand new Charlie Rebel album that's currently on sale at the minute. Just go on to my the merchandise website, folks. So it's 16 tracks, and all of the money is going towards two great charities I've been supporting for the last couple of years: the Suicide Awareness Support Centre in West Belfast and PIPS in North Belfast. So really, really proud to be supporting mental health in Belfast, folks. I always will, and if I can get any money towards their way. So basically the CDs, and there's USB pens as well, folks. They're £11 each, so they are, and basically just whatever posting packaging. So yeah, we're going to finish up here, folks. Again, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure with Joe, and I'm looking forward to listening back on this. So we're going to finish up. Here's the Irish Brigade. This one's recorded a few years ago with the Streets of Gibraltar, and of course we Mickey, the man who wrote the song with his wife Maura, is singing. Here we go, folks. Again, thank you very much. Good night, God bless.
We'll slow down again this time. This time it's a song from Riad Farrell, Sean Savage and Daniel McCann, who died on the streets of Gibraltar. A lovely ballad written by Mickey and Maura.
They flew out of Belfast with an ambitious plan to continue the struggle to free Ireland. Maria Farrell, Sean Savage and Daniel McCann, but they died on the streets of Gibraltar. In a nice and watching that followed as one, they knew they weren't armed, that none had a gun. We'll give them no warning or no chance to run, for all three must die on Gibraltar. And sad are things in Belfast now. All Ireland shares their sorrow as they walk in the sun, hitting Brits through their guns, and their blood stained the streets of Gibraltar. The SS stood there, so proud of them. 3 more freedom fighters lay dead in the street, like the flock of martyrs in ambush beneath. But our three far away in Gibraltar, sad are things in Belfast now. All Ireland shares their sorrow as they walk in the sun, hitting Brits through their guns, and their blood stained the streets of Gibraltar. Married while in prison, we watched you cry. True to all we believed in, and for us you died. with 2 fine volunteers, Dan and Sean at your side. Half part of us died in Gibraltar, and some of the homes in Belfast now. All Ireland shares their sorrow as they walked in the sun, hidden Brits through their guns, and their blood stained the streets of Gibraltar. It happens each time that a volunteer dies. They screen off the truth with a cover of lies, but we know what happens, although it's denied. They planted 3 deaths on Gibraltar, and sad fields in Belfast now. All Ireland shares their sorrow as they walked in the sun, hidden Brits through their guns, and their blood stained the streets of Gibraltar, and their blood stained the streets of Gibraltar.
You've been listening to Rebel podcast of Rory Carton. To listen to this and past episodes again, and to also check out future episodes, keep an eye on our official SoundCloud page. We're also available on all social media outlets. Just search Rebel podcast. Bhí sé bhgéisteach an sin is an fád cruúlaí Rebel le Rory McCarson. Le héisteach le seo agus hir hagran a ríis, agus na hagran atá le teach, caisúil ar siúificail sugin ar SoundCloud, agus táid ar fáil ar gach cinneal ardan ar na main thuisiilta. Ní mór dit ach fád cruúlaí Rebel a chuirda.